Elias Thornton arrived in Nebraska in 1886 with $47, 3 children, and a fresh grave behind him on the trail. Heating a sod house through winter required 3 tons of coal, $42. That left $5 for food, seed, tools, and everything else until spring. The math was impossible. Everyone said so. On January 12, 1888, the deadly schoolhouse blizzard killed 235 people. Temperatures dropped to 36 below zero. Neighbors burned their furniture and still froze. Inside Thornton's structure, a pit dug 6 feet into the earth covered with salvaged glass. 4 people sat in 43-degree warmth. No fuel consumed. No fire lit. He had beaten the impossible math with physics. This is how. The wind hit 60 miles per hour, and the temperature had dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. Outside, the snow fell so fine it passed through buttonholes and seams, filling lungs with ice. Across Nebraska and Dakota Territory, children stumbled blind through whiteouts, their teachers screaming names that the wind devoured. Cattle froze, standing upright. A woman died with her hand on her own door latch, unable to find it in the white. Inside a half-buried structure on the Nebraska prairie, Elias Thornton watched his youngest daughter draw pictures in the condensation on the glass. The thermometer on the wall read 67 degrees. Through the angled roof, now layered with snow, gray light still filtered down, enough to see, enough to live. Margaret hummed a song her mother used to sing. 3 feet of earth surrounded them. The glass creaked under the snow's weight. From somewhere in the white chaos outside came the sound of cattle screaming. The Higgins herd, lost and dying in the fields. Thornton's hands were still. His children were warm. The schoolhouse blizzard of January 1888 would kill more than 200 people before it ended. Many of them died within steps of safety, unable to find doors they had opened 1,000 times. But in this cavity carved into a hillside covered with salvaged glass and oiled cloth, 4 people sat in shirt sleeves while their neighbors burned furniture and prayed. 18 months earlier, Elias Thornton had arrived on this land with $47, 3 children, and a fresh grave behind him on the trail. Every man who saw his plan called him a fool. They were about to learn what a fool could build. The wagon reached Frontier County, Nebraska, in late August of 1886. Martha Thornton was not in it. She lay in a grave outside Kearney, dead of cholera at 31 years old, and her husband had not stopped moving since they shoveled the last dirt over her body. Elias drove with his left hand. His right held Margaret, who was 5 and had stopped asking where her mother was. Behind them, Sarah and Thomas sat among the remaining supplies, flour, seeds, tools, and the small wooden box that held everything they had not sold or buried. The land was flat and treeless. Grass stretched to every horizon, broken only by the occasional sod house, squatting like a mud-colored growth on the plain. The government had promised 160 acres to anyone who could prove up the land, live on it, improve it, survive it for 5 years. Martha had read about it in Ohio. She had dreamed of sky and space and soil that belonged to no one but them. Now the dream belonged to Elias, and he had $47 to make it real. He found his claim 2 miles south of a family named Higgins. The land rose slightly to the north, forming a gentle hill that faced south. A seasonal creek ran through the eastern quarter. The grass was thick and the soil was dark, and Martha would have loved it, which made it hard to look at for very long. They slept in the wagon that first night. Thomas asked when they would build a house. Elias said soon. Sarah, who was 12 and understood more than she should, said nothing at all. The next morning, Horace Higgins rode down from the north. He was 56 years old and had been homesteading Nebraska since before the grasshopper plagues. His face looked like leather that had been left in the sun, and then the rain, and then the sun again. He studied Thornton's wagon, his children, his tools, and his lack of everything else, and he did not dismount. "You're the new claim," Higgins said. "Heard you lost your wife on the trail." "I did." "You got money for lumber?" "Some." "How much?" Thornton hesitated. On the frontier, money was survival, and telling a stranger how much you had was like showing a wolf your throat. But Higgins had not asked with greed. He had asked the way a doctor asks where it hurts. $47, Thornton said. Higgins looked at the children. He looked at the horizon. He looked at Thornton the way men look at graves they know they will have to dig. "You need 8 cords of firewood to heat a sod house through winter," Higgins said. "You got no trees on this claim. None of us do. So you burn prairie hay, which takes twice as much and burns half as hot. Or you buy coal in McCook, $14 a ton, and you'll need 3 tons minimum if the winter's mild, $42 for coal, $3 to haul it. That's 45 of your 47 right there." He paused. "That leaves $2 for food, seed, tools, medicine, and everything else you'll need between now and April." Thornton's left arm ached. An old wound from the war, a Minier ball that had passed through the meat above his elbow and left the muscles twisted. It always ached when he was tired or worried or afraid. "I can build a dugout," Thornton said. "Cut into the hill. They stay warmer than sod houses." "Warmer than the surface," Higgins agreed. "Not warm. You'll still need fuel. The earth keeps you from dying. It don't keep you comfortable, and it sure don't keep children from coughing themselves sick for 4 months straight." He gathered his reins. "There's a widow 3 miles south, Mrs. Morrison. She might have work for you if you can swing an axe with that arm. Her husband died, and she's got hay that needs cutting. Thank you." Higgins turned his horse. Then he stopped. "I lost 2 neighbors in the hard winter," he said. 80 to 81. Found them in their soddy come spring. They'd burned everything they owned, furniture, doors, the baby's cradle. Still froze to death. 3 children with them. He looked at Margaret, who was watching a grasshopper climb a stalk of grass. "Those children need a father who understands what winter means out here. Not a man with theories. A man with fuel." He rode north. Thornton watched him go. Margaret asked if the man was angry at them. Thornton said no. Sarah said nothing. That night, by the light of a tallow candle, Thornton wrote the numbers on a scrap of paper. The numbers did not add up. They could not add up. There was no configuration of money and time and labor that allowed him to buy enough fuel and build adequate shelter and feed his children and survive until spring. He worked the figures again. Then again. The answer was always the same. Martha had believed in this land. Martha had read the pamphlets and traced the railroad maps and told him that the soil was free and the sky was endless, and their children would grow up with something to call their own. Martha was dead, and the math said their children would join her. Thornton folded the paper. He did not sleep. In the morning, he hitched what remained of their horses and drove to Stockville, 18 miles east, to see what he could learn. The general store in Stockville was run by a man named Hawkins, who had come west for gold and found groceries instead. He sold everything from nails to patent medicine, and in the back corner, stacked beside the almanacs and seed catalogs, he kept a pile of water-stained agricultural journals that he let customers read if they purchased something first. Thornton bought a pound of coffee he could not afford. Then he sat in the corner and read. He read about sod house construction and the depth to set posts. He read about breaking prairie with oxen he did not have. He read about drought and grasshoppers and prairie fires and hailstorms and the 1,000 ways the land could kill you. He was looking for something, though he did not know what. On the second day, in a copy of American Agriculturist from 1879, he found it. The article was about hotbeds. Northern farmers used them to start vegetables early, before the ground thawed. You dug a pit, filled it with fresh manure for heat, covered it with a wooden frame and glass, and the combination of decomposing manure and captured sunlight kept the soil warm enough to germinate seeds weeks ahead of the season. Thornton had seen hotbeds in Ohio. That was not the discovery. The discovery was a single paragraph near the end. The author mentioned that the earth below the frost line, 6 feet down in most northern climates, maintained a constant temperature regardless of surface conditions. In Nebraska, that temperature was between 50 and 55 degrees. Winter or summer, blizzard or heat wave, the deep earth held its warmth. Thornton read the paragraph 3 times. Then he put down the journal and stared at the wall. 50 degrees was not warm. You would not want to live in a 50-degree house. But 50 degrees was not freezing. 50 degrees meant your water did not ice over, and your breath did not cloud, and your children did not wake with frost on their blankets. And if you covered a hole in the earth with glass, the way you covered a hotbed, the sun would add to that 50 degrees. Even weak winter sun angled low and gray. He had seen hotbeds reach 80 degrees on cloudy March days. If the earth gave you 50 and the glass gave you 20, that was 70 degrees. That was warm without fuel. He asked Hawkins if he could borrow a pencil. The design took shape on the back of a feed bill. A rectangular pit dug into a south-facing hillside. 6 feet deep, 12 feet wide, 16 feet from front to back. North wall made of the hillside itself, solid earth, the best insulation nature provided. East and west walls cut straight and lined with sod. South wall built up 3 feet, then angled glass from there to the top of the north wall. The glass would face the winter sun. The earth would hold the heat. The whole thing would work like a hotbed built for living. Thornton looked at his design. He looked at the numbers beside it. Materials: $6 for salvaged glass, nails, minimal lumber. Labor: 1 man with a shovel. Time: if he dug 16 cubic feet per day, he would finish in 72 days. Winter arrived in 45. The timeline did not work. Of course it did not. Nothing worked. But the physics were sound. He was certain of that. The earth did not care about schedules or skeptics or the opinions of men who had survived 20 winters the hard way. The earth held 50 degrees at 6 feet down. That was a fact measured in Pennsylvania in 1663, and in England in 1740, and in Nebraska last year. The sun added heat through glass. That was a fact proven in every greenhouse and hotbed and conservatory in the world. If he could dig faster, if he could find a way to move more earth, he could build a home that did not need fuel. A home that would not kill his children when the coal ran out. He folded the feed bill into his pocket and went to find the man Hawkins had mentioned. The one with salvaged window glass from an abandoned homestead. The man laughed when Thornton offered $2 for the lot. "Take them," the man said. "They're worthless, but you're a fool if you think you can heat a house with windows." Thornton loaded the glass into his wagon. 3 sashes, 2 feet by 3 feet each, cracked in places but still whole. He handled them like they were made of gold. That night in the wagon, Sarah asked what the glass was for. Thornton explained. He told her about earth temperature and solar gain and thermal mass and every other principle he had read about in Hawkins's journals. He drew diagrams in the dust on the wagon bed. He showed her the math. When he finished, Sarah was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Pa, if you say the numbers work, they work. You taught me that numbers don't lie." Thomas wanted to know if they would really live in a hole. Margaret wanted to know if the hole would be warm. Thornton said yes. He said it like he believed it. He almost did. The next morning, Samuel Morrison rode up from the south. He was the widow Morrison's brother-in-law, 42 years old, a former school teacher who had come west to help his dead brother's wife keep her claim. He wore spectacles and spoke like a man who had read books, and he looked at Thornton's glass-loaded wagon with the expression of someone who has just been told the moon is made of cheese. "I've heard what you're planning," Morrison said. "My sister-in-law mentioned that the new claimant was building something unusual. I thought I should see for myself." Word travels fast. Not much else to talk about out here. Morrison adjusted his spectacles. "Mr. Thornton, I appreciate creative thinking. I was an educator before I came west, and I value innovation. But what you're describing is a root cellar with windows. The Earth stays cool in summer precisely because it does not hold heat. What makes you think it will warm you in winter?" "The Earth doesn't get cold," Thornton said. "That's the point. It stays at 50 degrees year-round, 6 feet down. The glass adds to that. I'm not trying to fight winter. I'm trying to hide from it." Morrison shook his head. "And when the glass breaks in a storm? When snow buries your roof and the light stops coming? When spring rains turn your walls to mud and the whole thing collapses inward?" He pointed at Margaret, who was picking wildflowers near the wagon. "You'll have built your own grave, Mr. Thornton, and your children will be in it with you. The walls will be 3 feet thick at the base, rammed earth, solid as stone. I've seen dugouts that lasted 20 years. Dugouts with proper roofs, sod roofs, not glass." Morrison sighed. "I'm not trying to be cruel. My brother died because he underestimated what this land can do. I watched his wife dig his grave in frozen ground, alone, because no one could reach her in time to help. I do not want to watch her do the same for your children." "I understand. I hope you do." Morrison gathered his reins. "When your experiment fails, come to the Morrison claim. We'll find room for you and the children, better crowded and alive than alone and frozen." He rode south. Thornton began digging. The shovel bit into Nebraska soil, and the pile of displaced earth began to grow. Day 1, Day 2, Day 3. Thornton rose before dawn and dug until his arms could not lift the spade. Sarah cooked meals and watched the younger children. Thomas carried water from the creek. Margaret picked the stones out of the dirt pile because she wanted to help and because Thornton needed the stones for later. The math remained impossible. 16 cubic feet per day, 72 days needed. 45 days until winter. But Thornton kept digging because stopping meant accepting that his children would freeze, and that was not something he could accept. On day 4, Cyrus Webb came to the claim. Webb operated a small land office in Stockville. He was 48 years old and had fingers like sausages and eyes like a pig deciding which part of the trough to root in next. He had been buying failed homesteads for 10 years, claims abandoned by settlers who gave up, died, or simply disappeared. He acquired them cheap at auction and sold them dear to the next wave of dreamers. Thornton's claim had a seasonal creek. Water rights made land valuable. Webb had been watching. "Mr. Thornton," Webb said, dismounting with a grunt, "I heard about your situation. A widower with 3 children trying to homestead alone. A tragedy in the making, some would say." "Some would?" "I came to make you an offer." Webb smiled. His teeth were yellow. "I know times are hard. I know the numbers don't work. Everyone in Stockville knows you only have $47, and that won't get you through winter any way you figure it. So I'm prepared to offer you fair market value for your claim. Right now, today. You take your children somewhere safer, California, maybe. They have mild winters there. And I take this land off your hands. It's not for sale. Think about it, Mr. Thornton. I'm not the enemy here. The prairie is the enemy. The winter is the enemy. I'm offering you a way out before those enemies destroy your family." He glanced at Margaret, who had stopped picking stones to watch the stranger. It would be a shame for those children to suffer because their father was too proud to recognize when he was beaten. I said it's not for sale. Webb's smile did not waver. I'll be in Stockville when you change your mind. The offer expires when the first snow falls. After that, he shrugged. After that, you'll be too desperate to get fair value, and I'm a businessman, not a charity. He rode toward town. At the edge of the claim, he turned in his saddle. That man is going to bury his children in a hole in the ground, he called, loud enough for the children to hear. Remember I tried to help. Sarah's hands were clenched at her sides. Thomas had picked up a rock, as if he might throw it. Margaret asked why the man was so mean. Thornton went back to digging, but his arms were tired, and his war wound throbbed, and the math still did not work, and for the first time since Martha died, he wondered if Webb was right. By day 6, Thornton abandoned careful excavation. The proper method was to dig straight down, maintaining vertical walls, shoring them with timber as you went. But timber cost money and proper method cost time, and Thornton had neither. So he began undercutting the hillside instead, carving into the slope at an angle and counting on the root-bound prairie sod to hold the ceiling until he could stabilize it. This was dangerous. Everyone knew it was dangerous. If the overhang collapsed, it would bury him alive, and his children would find him the way the settlers found men in mining accidents, one hand reaching up through the dirt, or not even that. But dangerous was faster. 32 cubic feet per day instead of 16. At this pace, the pit would be finished in 36 days. Winter arrived in 39, 3 days of margin. It was not enough. It was something. Sarah watched him crawl under the overhang each morning and crawl out each evening. She did not say anything about the risk. She understood the math as well as he did. On day 9, the widow Morrison appeared. She was not what Thornton expected. He had pictured an old woman worn down by grief and hardship. Mrs. Morrison was 51 years old, with gray hair pulled back tight and hands that looked like they could strangle a coyote. She led a mule that pulled a strange contraption, a metal scoop on wooden runners, the kind of thing railroad crews used to move earth. My husband bought this drag scraper in '78, she said without preamble. Never used it. I've been waiting for someone who needed it more than I needed the rust. I can't pay you. I didn't ask for money. She looped the mule's lead around a stake. I heard what Webb said in town. That man took my neighbor's claim when she couldn't make the tax payment, offered her half what it was worth, and smiled while he did it. I won't help him take another one. Why help me? She looked at the half-dug pit, at the children watching from the wagon, at the glass sashes leaning against a pile of earth. Because I know what it's like to be alone out here with everyone waiting for you to fail, she said. And because you'll help me stack hay next month if you survive. The work wants doing, and I can't do it alone. It was charity dressed as trade. Both of them knew it. Neither said so. The drag scraper moved 5 times as much earth as a shovel. With the mule's strength behind it, Thornton carved great scoops out of the hillside, piling displaced soil to the north and south in growing mounds. His timeline collapsed from 36 days to 12. His body did not care about timelines. By day 12, his hands were more blister than skin. The war wound in his left arm had swollen until he could barely grip the scraper's handles. He had lost weight he could not afford to lose, and his belt needed a new notch, and every morning he woke with his muscles screaming that they could not do this again. Every morning he did it again. By day 18, the pit was excavated. 12 feet wide, east to west, 16 feet deep, north to south, 6 feet down at the deepest point. The north wall was the hillside itself, solid earth, root-bound and stable. The east and west walls were cut vertical and true, waiting for reinforcement. The south side opened to the sky, where the glass would go, but the walls were just dirt. In a rainstorm, they would slump. In a freeze-thaw cycle, they would crack. Thornton needed to stabilize them before he could mount the glass. He began the rammed earth process. Wet soil, packed into wooden forms, pounded with a heavy wooden post until it was dense as clay brick. 3 feet thick at the base, tapering to 18 inches at the top. The forms came from lumber he could not afford, purchased with money that should have gone to food. $22 remained. Food for 2 weeks sat in the wagon. After that, he would need to hunt, or beg, or let his children go hungry. Sarah took over more of the work. She cooked every meal, mended every torn garment, kept Margaret occupied, and Thomas from wandering too far. She was 12 years old and acting 40, and Thornton watched her carry burdens no child should carry and could not find words to thank her. The walls went up. 3 days for the east wall, 3 days for the west. The south wall was different, only 3 feet of earth, topped with a wooden sill where the glass would rest. Thornton set the sill himself, checking the angle with a plumb bob and shadow measurements. 40 degrees from horizontal, steep enough to catch the low winter sun, flat enough to shed heavy snow. October arrived. The first frost came on the 3rd, a week earlier than expected. Thornton woke to white grass and a skin of ice on the water bucket, and a cold that bit through his blanket like teeth. But inside the unfinished structure, where the walls were up but the glass was not yet mounted, the temperature read 47 degrees. He stood in the pit and felt the earth's warmth radiating from the walls. Not hot, not comfortable, but not freezing. The deep soil held its heat the way the journal had promised, indifferent to the frost above. The physics were working. The earth was doing its job. All he had to do was finish the glass. October 4th through 6th was the glass. Thornton mounted the 3 salvage sashes on the wooden frame, angling them south at 40 degrees. The gaps between sashes and earth walls he sealed with a mixture of mud, prairie hay, and rendered tallow, the same mixture settlers used to caulk sod house walls, sticky and waterproof and ugly as sin. Behind the glass, he stretched the oiled cloth. This was the key insight from the hotbed article. A single pane of glass lost heat quickly. But if you created an air gap, even an inch or two, the trapped air acted as insulation, slowing the escape of warmth. The oiled cloth was not as clear as glass, but it let enough light through, and the air pocket behind it made the whole structure twice as efficient. October 7th was the first full day of operation. Thornton sealed the entry with a canvas curtain and woke before dawn to check the thermometer. 48 degrees. The sun had not yet risen, and the interior was already above freezing. By midday, with the autumn sun streaming through the angled glass, the thermometer read 71 degrees. Sarah stood in the center of the space and took off her shawl. "Pa," she said, "it's warm." It was warm, warmer than their wagon, warmer than any soddy Thornton had entered, warmer than seemed possible for a hole in the ground with no fire and no stove and no fuel of any kind. The numbers had not lied. Thornton sat down on the packed earth floor. His hands were bleeding through their calluses, and his arm throbbed with every heartbeat, and he had $19 left and winter was still coming. But the thermometer read 71 degrees, and his daughter was warm, and for the first time since Kearney, since the shovel and the grave and the dirt falling on Martha's face, Elias Thornton allowed himself to believe they might survive. The weeks that followed were refinement. An early October rain revealed water seeping through the south wall at ground level. Thornton dug a gravel-filled trench around the exterior, directing runoff away from the structure. The seepage stopped. A sunny day pushed the interior temperature to 85 degrees, too hot for comfort. Thornton cut a small hinged panel into the glass roof at its peak, allowing hot air to escape when needed. The ventilation balanced the system. He gathered stones from the creek bed and stacked them along the north wall. Thermal mass, the journals called it. The stones absorbed heat during sunny days and released it at night, smoothing out the temperature swings. By November, the interior held between 48 degrees at dawn and 76 degrees at midday, a range you could live in, work in, sleep in without shivering. The canvas curtain became a proper door, traded for 2 days of labor to a carpenter passing through. Thornton extended the entry into an alcove, creating an airlock effect. You entered the alcove, closed the outer door, then opened the inner door, and the cold never touched the living space. Higgins rode by in late November. He had not visited since his warning, and Thornton expected mockery or dismissal or the satisfied tone of a man preparing to say, "I told you so." Higgins dismounted. He studied the structure, the half-buried walls, the angled glass roof, the smoke-free chimney stack that needed no smoke because there was no fire. Then he walked down the entry steps and stood inside. The thermometer read 61 degrees. Outside, the November air was 32 and dropping. Higgins removed his hat. He looked at the glass, the earthen walls, the children sitting comfortably without coats. "One mild winter don't prove anything, Thornton," he said finally. "Wait until a real blizzard hits." But he stayed for coffee. It was the first social visit Thornton had received since arriving. December came. January of 1887. The coldest night dropped to 18 degrees below zero, and Thornton woke in darkness to check the thermometer. 44 degrees. His children slept without shivering. The earth held its warmth. By spring, they had survived. No fuel purchased, no coal hauled from a cook, no furniture burned, no desperate prayers, no children coughing through frozen nights. The glass roof dugout had done exactly what the numbers said it would do. Morrison, the brother-in-law, visited in March. He brought a measuring tape and a notebook. He asked questions for 2 hours, recording dimensions and temperatures and construction details with the precision of a man trained in science. "I was wrong about you, Mr. Thornton," he said. "This is not a grave. This is something else entirely." But he added, "The winter of 86 to 87 was mild. Ask anyone. The real cold, the hard winter cold, the kind that kills, hasn't tested this structure yet. It may work in ordinary winters. It may fail when the weather truly turns." Thornton nodded. He had thought the same thing. The summer of 1887 was warm. The autumn was warmer, a false fall that lulled settlers into complacency, that let cattle roam far from shelter and children walk to school in light coats. The old-timers noticed things. Muskrat houses built unusually high, geese leaving 3 weeks early, the widow Morrison's joints aching worse than any year she could remember. Something was coming, something worse than 1887, and it would come without warning on a January morning when the sky was clear and the temperature was pleasant, and 200 people would die before the sun set again. But Thornton did not know that yet. All he knew was that his children were alive, his structure was proven, and he had made it through one winter with physics instead of fuel. The next winter would be different. The next winter the sky would turn a color he had never seen. The morning of January 12, 1888, began with a lie. The temperature at dawn was 28 degrees, cold, but not bitter. The sky had cleared after days of gray, and the sun rose pale and promising over the Nebraska prairie. Children who had been kept home for weeks put on light coats and walked to school. Farmers who had delayed repairs ventured out to fix fences. The widow Morrison's brother-in-law announced he would hold lessons at the Morrison claim, and Sarah and Thomas Thornton asked their father if they could go. Thornton said yes. The sky was clear. The walk was only 2 miles. They had made it a dozen times before. Sarah wore a shawl over her dress. Thomas forgot his gloves on the table. Margaret, who was 6 now and too young for lessons, stayed behind to help her father mend the door hinge that had been sticking since November. Thornton watched his older children walk north until they disappeared over the rise. The sun was warm on his face. The air smelled like thawing earth. 2 hours later, the northwestern horizon vanished. Thornton was outside the dugout, gathering prairie hay for the bedding that needed refreshing. He straightened to stretch his back and saw it, a wall of gray-white rolling toward him like smoke from a burning city, swallowing the sky as it came. The color was wrong, sickly yellow at the edges, bruised purple beneath. He had never seen anything like it. The wind hit before he could move. One moment the air was still, the next it was screaming. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the time it took him to turn toward the dugout. Snow began falling, not falling, flying, horizontal and blinding, so fine it seemed less like snow than like flour sifted through the air. He could not see his hand in front of his face. He could not see the dugout 15 feet away. Margaret was inside. His other children were somewhere on the prairie between here and the Morrison claim. Thornton ran. He found the dugout entry by memory and luck, stumbling down the steps with snow already coating his clothes. Margaret stood at the bottom, eyes wide, asking why the sky was making that sound. "Stay here," Thornton said. "Do not leave. Do you understand? Do not open the door for anyone but me." He grabbed the coil of rope hanging by the entry, tied one end to the door frame, took the other end in his fist, then he walked back into the white. The rope paid out behind him as he pushed north. The wind hit his face like a fist made of needles. He could not see the ground beneath his feet. He could not see anything. The world had become a howling blank, white in every direction, the snow so thick it filled his nose and mouth and eyes. He screamed his children's names. The wind swallowed the sound before it left his lips. 50 yards. The rope ran out. He stood at the end of his tether, blind, deaf, frozen, and his children were somewhere beyond this point, somewhere in the white, and he could not reach them. He pulled the rope. It led back to the dugout, to Margaret, to safety. His other children were out there, dying maybe, lost, certainly, and he could not find them. A man could walk in circles for hours in a whiteout. Men had frozen to death 20 feet from their own doors, unable to find them. If Thornton released the rope, if he pushed forward into the storm, he would die. And then Margaret would be alone in the dugout, waiting for a father who never returned. He had buried one family member already this year. Thornton turned back. He followed the rope hand over hand, sobbing into the wind, and stumbled down the dugout steps and pulled the door closed behind him. Margaret was crying. She asked where Sarah was, where Thomas was. Thornton could not answer. He held his daughter and listened to the wind scream and prayed to a God he was no longer certain existed. The hours passed in darkness. By 2 in the afternoon, the exterior temperature had dropped to 8 degrees below zero. Inside the dugout, the thermometer read 54 degrees. The glass roof was buried under snow. No light penetrated, but the earth walls held their warmth, indifferent to the chaos above. By 4, the temperature outside had fallen to 22 below. The wind gusted past 60 miles per hour. Somewhere in the white, cattle were freezing where they stood. Children who had walked to school that morning were huddled in sod schoolhouses, their teachers trying to decide whether to stay and hope for rescue or venture out and try to lead them home. Some who ventured out never arrived. By 6, The exterior temperature hit 31 below zero. Inside the dugout, the thermometer read 47 degrees. Thornton lit a candle, the first artificial light the structure had ever needed. The flame was steady. The air was still. Margaret had stopped crying and sat wrapped in blankets, watching the candle and waiting. "When are they coming home, Pa?" Thornton did not answer. He could not. By midnight, the temperature outside had dropped to 36 below zero. The dugout interior read 44 degrees, the coldest Thornton had ever recorded. He wrapped Margaret in every blanket they owned and held her against his chest. The wind screamed. The glass groaned under the snow's weight. From somewhere outside came sounds that might have been cattle dying, or might have been human voices, or might have been nothing but the storm playing tricks. Thornton listened for his children's voices. He heard only the wind. At 3 in the morning, something hit the door. Not the wind, something solid. Scratching, then pounding. Thornton lunged for the entry, heart hammering. He pulled the door open against the pressure of drifted snow. The widow Morrison collapsed into the alcove. Her face was white. Her fingers were white. She could not speak. Her lips were cracked and frozen, and when she tried to form words, nothing came but a moan. She had been trying to reach her own soddy when the storm hit, had gotten disoriented in the whiteout, and had stumbled into Thornton's excavated entryway by pure accident. Another 50 feet in any direction, and she would have walked past and kept walking until she froze. Thornton dragged her inside. Her fingers were the color of tallow candles, frostbite severe. She might lose them. He closed the door against the howling white. Now he had a critically injured woman and his youngest daughter, and still no idea if his other children were alive. The thermometer read 43 degrees. The earth held its warmth. The storm raged on. The widow Morrison drifted in and out of consciousness through the night. Thornton rubbed her hands slowly, trying to restore circulation without causing more damage. He wrapped hot stones from the floor in cloth and placed them around her body. He fed her sips of water when she could swallow. Near dawn, she opened her eyes and focused on his face. "Samuel," she whispered, "went after your children, just before it hit." Thornton's stomach dropped. Samuel Morrison, the brother-in-law, the skeptic, the school teacher, had seen the storm coming and gone out to find Sarah and Thomas. Now 3 more people were somewhere on the prairie. 3 more people who might already be dead. The wind began to die around 6 in the morning. The screaming faded to a moan, then to silence. The sudden quiet was almost worse. It felt like the world holding its breath. Thornton checked the thermometer. 43 degrees inside. He opened the door. The entry steps were buried under 4 feet of snow, packed nearly solid by the wind. He dug upward with his hands, clawing through the drift until gray light appeared above him. He broke through to the surface and pulled himself out. The world was white. Every landmark had vanished. The prairie was a smooth expanse of snow, sculpted into drifts 20 feet high in places, scoured down to frozen grass in others. The temperature was 28 below zero. The sky was clear and pale and utterly indifferent. There was no sign of his children. Thornton marked the dugout with a pole and a scrap of cloth. Then he walked north toward where the Morrison claim should be. The snow was waist-deep in places, crusted hard enough to walk on in others. He broke through unpredictably, plunging to his thighs, hauling himself out, continuing. He found nothing. The drifts had erased every fence post, every path, every familiar shape. He could not even be certain he was walking in the right direction. He returned to the dugout, checked the marker, adjusted his bearing, walked north again. On his 3rd attempt, at 10 in the morning, He saw movement on the southern horizon. 3 figures moving slowly, one large, carrying something, two smaller, close together. Thornton ran. Samuel Morrison was carrying Thomas. The boy was alive but snow-blind, his eyes swollen shut from hours of ice crystals driven into his face. Sarah walked behind them, one arm around her brother, the other pressed against her side. She was limping. Her shoes were soaked through, and her feet were the wrong color. "Found them against a fence post," Morrison said. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Half-mile north of here, they'd covered themselves with hay from a collapsed stack. Stayed in a snow cave all night." A snow cave. The temperature inside a properly made snow cave could reach 15 degrees, cold enough for frostbite, warm enough to survive. Sarah looked at her father. Her face was red and windburned, and she was shaking uncontrollably, but she was alive. "I told Thomas to keep his eyes closed," she said. He didn't listen. Thomas tried to smile. His lips were cracked and bleeding. "I wanted to see the snow," he said. Thornton carried his son down the dugout steps. Sarah followed, limping badly. Morrison came last, half falling down the entry. They sealed the door behind them. Inside, the thermometer read 46 degrees. The widow Morrison was conscious, sitting up, her ruined fingers wrapped in cloth. She saw her brother-in-law and began to weep. 4 people had survived the night in this cavity of earth and glass. Outside, across Nebraska and Dakota Territory, the bodies were still being counted. The schoolhouse blizzard killed 235 people. Teachers had led children into the white and lost them within yards of safety. A 19-year-old named Etta Shattuck got lost walking home from her schoolhouse, sheltered in a haystack for 78 hours, and survived, but lost both feet to frostbite. In Bonham County, Dakota Territory, a teacher and 9 students scattered in the whiteout. All 10 died. Their bodies were not found until spring. A woman in Holt County froze to death in her own doorway, her hand on the latch she could not find. A boy in Seward County was found standing upright, frozen solid, his arms stretched toward a barn he had missed by 6 feet. The Thornton family lost 2 of Sarah's toes to frostbite. Thomas recovered from snow blindness in 3 days. His sight returned slowly, painfully, but completely. The widow Morrison lost 2 fingers on her left hand. Samuel Morrison lost nothing but his certainty that he understood what the prairie could do. The glass-roofed dugout had maintained 43 degrees at its coldest. No fuel consumed, no fire lit, no furniture burned in desperation. While neighbors froze, while children died in schoolhouses, while the temperature dropped to 36 below zero and the wind screamed past 60 miles per hour, the earth had held its warmth. Higgins lost 8 head of cattle. His family survived, but they burned most of their furniture when the coal ran out. The widow Morrison's neighbor 3 miles south, a woman named Patterson, was found dead in her cabin 2 days after the storm. She had burned everything she owned. It had not been enough. Cyrus Webb lost nothing. He had been in Stockville when the storm hit, sheltered in the hotel, counting the claims that would come up for auction in the spring. He did not get the Thornton claim. 3 days after the blizzard, Horace Higgins rode south. His horse moved slowly through the drifted snow. The prairie was still white and silent, scarred with the tracks of search parties looking for bodies. Smoke rose from the Thornton claim, not from a chimney, but from a small fire outside the dugout where Thornton was melting snow for water. Higgins dismounted. He looked at the half-buried structure, the glass roof now cleared of snow and gleaming in the winter sun. He looked at the children visible through the glass, Thomas with bandages over his eyes, Sarah with her foot elevated, Margaret drawing pictures in the condensation. He walked down the entry steps without asking permission. Inside, the thermometer read 58 degrees. The widow Morrison sat in a chair Thornton had built, her bandaged hands in her lap. Samuel Morrison stood by the south wall, making notes in a small book. The air smelled like warmth and bodies and survival. Higgins removed his hat. He stood in the center of the space for a long moment, saying nothing. "Thornton," he said finally, "I heard your children made it." "They did? With help?" "I heard the widow would have died if she hadn't found your door." "The earth doesn't care who comes in, Higgins, just keeps them warm." Higgins looked at the glass roof, the earthen walls, the stones stacked along the north side still radiating heat from the day's sun. "I called you a fool," he said. "I was wrong." "You were trying to help, in your way." "I was trying to make myself feel smarter than the man from Ohio. Pride's kept more men warm than wisdom, but it's killed more too." He turned his hat in his hands. "What do you call this thing you've built?" "Been calling it the glass dugout, but Margaret calls it the warm house." "She's got the right of it." Higgins put his hat back on. "I lost 8 cattle in that storm. My wife burned her grandmother's rocking chair to keep the children warm. We made it through, but just barely." He paused at the entry. "I'd like to see your plans if you're willing to share them. Come spring, I might try building something similar for the livestock." "Come back any time," Thornton said. "I'll show you everything I know." Higgins climbed the steps and rode north. He did not look back, but he did not need to. He had seen enough. Samuel Morrison wrote the letter in March. He addressed it to the editors of American Agriculturist, the same journal where Thornton had found the paragraph about earth temperature that started everything. The letter described the glass roof dugout in detail: dimensions, materials, construction sequence, performance data. It included temperature readings from before, during, and after the schoolhouse blizzard. "I was among those who doubted this structure," Morrison wrote. "I told its builder he was constructing his own grave. I was wrong." On the night of January 12th, 1888, this building sheltered 4 people, including my own sister-in-law, through the worst storm in territorial memory. The interior temperature never dropped below 43 degrees. No fuel was consumed. The principles are sound: thermal mass, solar gain, earth insulation. What Mr. Thornton has built is not a curiosity. It is a proof of concept that deserves wider attention. The letter was published in May. It generated responses from Kansas, Dakota Territory, Minnesota, even a letter from a professor in Massachusetts who said the design reminded him of structures he had seen in European agricultural manuals. But the letters came slowly, and the visitors came faster. By April, 3 families had ridden to the Thornton claim to see the glass dugout for themselves. A farmer from Red Willow County, 40 miles west, stood inside and said, "Is it true you stayed warm all winter without coal?" "Without anything," Thornton said. "The earth does the work." A school teacher from McCook came in May. She had lost a student in the blizzard, a boy who wandered away from the schoolhouse and was found frozen a quarter-mile distant. She walked through the dugout, touching the walls, the glass, the stones along the north side. "My schoolhouse was colder than this," she said, "even with the stove going." "Build into the earth instead of on top of it," Thornton said. "Point the glass south. The sun does the rest." He drew diagrams for everyone who asked. He loaned his tools to a widow whose husband had died in the storm. He helped 2 neighbors begin excavations that spring, showing them how to angle the walls and seal the glass and position the thermal mass for maximum effect. "Why won't you take payment?" one of them asked. "The earth does the work," Thornton repeated. "I can't charge for the earth." Cyrus Webb never acknowledged Thornton's success. He rode past the claim once in early spring while Thornton was clearing the entry steps of the last snow. Their eyes met. Webb did not stop, did not speak, did not tip his hat. He simply rode on toward Stockville, his face set in an expression that could have been contempt or could have been something closer to fear. Later, Thornton heard Webb muttering in the general store, "Luck, one lucky winner. The prairie will take him eventually." But Webb stopped trying to acquire the claim. He moved his land speculation operations to Kansas the following year, where settlers still burned through their fuel and their savings and their hope in the traditional way. His legacy in Frontier County was a warning. There were men who profited from failure, and they would always be watching. By the fall of 1888, 3 other structures based on Thornton's design existed in Frontier County. One belonged to the widow Patterson's son, who had inherited his mother's claim after she froze to death in January. He built his glass dugout larger than Thornton's, 20 feet by 24, and used it to shelter livestock through the winter of 88 to 89. His cattle survived. His neighbors did not. One belonged to a Norwegian family named Lindquist, who had read Samuel Morrison's letter in American Agriculturist and traveled 200 miles to see the original structure. They built a hybrid design, a conventional frame house above, a glass-roofed pit below, connected by an interior staircase. The pit served as root cellar, greenhouse, and emergency shelter. They grew vegetables through January. One belonged to Horace Higgins. He built it small, 8 feet by 12, and used it for starting spring seedlings rather than for living. But he built it, and when he showed it to Thornton the following spring, his voice was quiet with something that might have been apology. "I've been homesteading out here for 16 years, Higgins said. "I thought I knew everything there was to know about keeping warm. Turns out I knew one way. You knew another." The innovation spread slowly, the way innovations did on the frontier, by word of mouth, by letters between neighbors, by the testimony of survivors who had seen the method work when it mattered most. Most settlers never adopted it. Coal became cheaper as the railroad network expanded. Lumber became more available. The old ways were good enough for those who could afford them, but for those who could not, for widows and orphans and newcomers with $47 and no other options, the glass-roofed dugout offered something new, a way to work with the earth instead of against it, a way to let the sun and the soil do what fire and fuel had always done before. Martha Thornton had dreamed of land that belonged to no one but them. She had not lived to see it, but her husband had built something on that land that would outlast sod houses and frame houses, and even in its principles, the frontier itself. Elias Thornton proved up his homestead in 1891, receiving full title to 160 acres of Nebraska prairie. The following year, he married the widow Morrison. She had helped save his children. He had saved her life. Together, they combined their claims, 320 acres of land with a seasonal creek running through it. They never built a conventional house. Instead, they expanded the original glass dugout into a complex of 3 connected structures: the living space, a root cellar, and a greenhouse where Sarah grew vegetables year-round. The glass needed replacing every few years. Hail and wind and the weight of snow took their toll, but the earthen walls held decade after decade, as solid as the day Thornton had pounded them into place. Sarah Thornton became a school teacher. She taught winter survival skills to her students, including the principle that had saved her family. If you cannot fight the cold, hide from it. Let the earth do the work. Thomas Thornton became a railroad engineer. He designed heated waiting shelters for stations along the transcontinental line, small structures with south-facing glass and thick walls, warm enough for passengers to survive delays in bitter weather. Margaret Thornton married a farmer in Red Willow County. She and her husband built a glass-roofed dugout for their first home. Their children grew up thinking it was normal to live in a hole in the ground that stayed warm without fire. Elias Thornton died in the spring of 1923 at 71 years old. His wife found him in the morning, still in bed, in the original structure he had built 37 years before. The walls were the same walls he had pounded into place with bleeding hands. The glass had been replaced 4 times, but the angle was still 40 degrees. The thermometer on the wall read 54 degrees. The local newspaper called him the man who buried his house and found the future. The future did not remember him. By 1920, most glass roof dugouts on the Great Plains had been abandoned. Coal was cheap, lumber was plentiful. The railroad brought everything settlers needed, and the old ways, the hard ways, the survival ways faded into memory. The knowledge that Thornton had pieced together from agricultural journals and first principles became a curiosity, then a footnote, then nothing at all. The earth still held its warmth. The sun still angled through glass. But no one remembered that these facts had once saved lives. Then the old crisis came back wearing new clothes. In the 1970s, oil prices quadrupled, and Americans rediscovered that fuel was not infinite. The Back to the Land movement sent young people to the countryside, where they built structures their great-grandparents would have recognized. Earth-bermed walls, south-facing glass, thermal mass to hold the heat. They called it passive solar and earth-sheltered construction, and wrote books about it as if they had invented something new. In the 1990s, farmers in Bolivia developed a structure they called a Walipini, a rectangular pit dug into the earth, covered with plastic sheeting, heated by the sun and the stable temperature of the deep soil. They grew vegetables year-round in climates that should have been too cold. Development organizations promoted the design across South America, then Africa, then Asia. The Walipini looked exactly like Thornton's glass dugout. The principles were identical. Whether the Bolivian farmers had ever heard of Nebraska homesteaders or had simply discovered the same physics independently, no one could say for certain. In the 2000s and 2010s, architects designed net zero homes that used the earth as a thermal battery and the sun as a furnace. They installed geothermal heat pumps that exploited the same stable underground temperature that Thornton had read about in an 1879 agricultural journal. They built underground data centers that cooled themselves with the Earth's constant 50-degree embrace. None of them knew about Elias Thornton. None of them needed to. The physics had always been there, waiting for anyone desperate enough or clever enough to use it. Today in Frontier County, Nebraska, there's a rectangular depression in a hillside 2 miles south of where the Higgins family once homesteaded. The glass is long gone. The wood rotted away decades ago. The walls have slumped into gentle slopes, softened by 140 years of rain and frost and the patient work of roots and worms. But the shape is still visible if you know what to look for. 12 feet by 16 feet, oriented south. On sunny winter days, the grass in that depression melts before anywhere else. The snow recedes from the south-facing slope, while drifts still linger on the north side of every fence post. The earth holds its warmth, as it did when Thornton first measured it, as it did when the schoolhouse blizzard killed 235 people, and 4 survivors sat in shirt sleeves and waited for dawn. The descendants of those survivors still live in Nebraska. Some of them know the story, most do not. The knowledge passed down through 3 or 4 generations, growing thinner each time, until it became a family legend, and then a half-remembered anecdote, and then nothing but a depression in a hillside that no one can explain. But the earth remembers. It holds 52 degrees at 6 feet down, winter or summer, blizzard or drought. It does not care about human memory or human innovation or human folly. It simply holds what it has always held, waiting for someone to notice. The prairie broke strong men. That is what they said. The old-timers who had watched their neighbors freeze and starve and give up and go back east. The prairie broke anyone who tried to fight it. But Elias Thornton did not try to fight the prairie. He asked a different question. What does the earth already know? What has the sun always given, if we build the right shape to receive it? His neighbors thought he was digging his own grave. They watched him haul dirt out of that hillside with bleeding hands, and they shook their heads, and they waited for the winter to prove them right. But the winter proved something else. 235 people died in the schoolhouse blizzard of 1888. 4 people survived in a hole in the ground covered with glass. The difference was $47, 6 weeks of digging, and one man who refused to believe that the only answer was more fuel, more burning, more force against the cold. Sometimes the frontier demanded things that pioneers could not give: wood when there were no trees, coal when there was no money, strength when the body had nothing left. And sometimes the frontier offered things that pioneers refused to see: earth that held its warmth, sun that gave its heat, solutions buried in the ground waiting for someone to dig. Elias Thornton dug, his children lived, and the earth, indifferent to memory and gratitude alike, goes on holding its 52 degrees, century after century, for anyone desperate enough to ask what it already knows.